As Brexit becomes a reality, the European Union is pushing for further integration with the ultimate goal of being the full federalisation of the EU as a state within itself. This is, of course, to make it all but impossible for any other nation to leave after the UK goes. The EU, in my opinion, will withstand the UK leaving, but if they saw another large, especially a net contributing country leave, this would be a country like Italy, like France, like Germany leaving, that could possibly derail the EU project to a point that it would just collapse like a tower of cards. Now, ultimately, I think the EU project will fail, but the timeline is, still quite a ways out. We're looking at least 5 years, probably more realistically 10, 15, maybe even 20 years for this project totally fails. So the politicians are pushing for full federalisation with, of course, making it almost impossible for any other nation to leave. Now, how will this happen? We can see evidence for this everywhere. First and foremost is the incoming president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. She is a self-styled federalist. She is someone that's written numerous articles, numerous video appearances, pushing for the full federalisation of the EU states. So she is the perfect person over the next 5 years to introduce policies and integration and just set the tone, the sentiment that will be the ever-growing EU state. Now, how will this be implemented? What sort of policies, what sort of areas will we see the federalisation starting? First and foremost is, of course, the European military. No nation is really a nation unless it has a military to defend itself. That is one of the first priorities of any nation. Any nation, if it doesn't have a military or a standing army, it's not really a country. There's three things that generally define a nation. First, you need a flag, you need a national anthem, and now they're pushing for the EU military. So that is the third pin. They've already got the flag, they've already got the anthem. The EU military will be the third thing that really defines the EU state as being almost a nation within itself, and then every other country within that will be a state within this larger empire that is the EU. So that's something that's certainly coming. The evidence for that is everywhere. Talk of an EU military is very hot right now. This is something they're just setting the tone. Obviously, this is something that I believe is resisted within EU citizens, but this will be implemented through the back door. It will be like command and control structures, and we see procurement now for the wider EU country. Sovereign states at the moment are going to start adopting the same equipment and be purchased through the umbrella of the EU. This is long term. The EU military isn't something that's going to come about overnight, but it is something the EU definitely want. It allows them to project power across the world, and it's very symbolic. Once a state, super state like the EU itself has a military, then it really sets itself on the world stage as a state that can project power around the world, and that really will be the defining moment of the EU project itself. Very symbolic. Another options that we have, something that's talked about in 2011, I predict further instability within the Eurozone, and last time we saw this significantly in 2011, 2012, the EU talked about the introduction of Eurobonds. So these would be financial bonds that the EU would probably sell themselves at a higher level. It could be sold at local level, like i.e. a struggling country like Italy could, rather than just sell Italian bonds, they could sell Euro bonds, which would be backed by the wider EU, by the ECB. This is something that was talked about in 2011, but the financial crisis at that point did blow by. Countries involved in that at that point were Portugal, Ireland, Greece, Spain, Cyprus. These are the particularly financially weak countries of the Eurozone. So I expect, if we see, almost certainly will happen, another financial crisis coming at some point over the next few years, a Eurobond is a good way of the EU further overreaching its power further, because once you have a Eurobond, that means you can then push for centralised tax collection, because if countries are selling a bond that is backed by the EU, then you can quite easily ask for a tax. So then you could then push for something like a federal income tax, or their version of a national insurance. Now, this is something that I would expect EU citizens again to push back from, but in a time of crisis, in a time of huge instability where it looks like potentially the euro could be brought down, or there could just be a mass financial crash across the whole of the EU, and especially the Eurozone itself, is something that the EU citizens may even just go along with. Initially, I expect something like a federal income tax to be quite low. It could be in the region of something like 1%. Incidentally, if they did adopt a 1% federal income tax across the EU, that would more than cover the net contributions that the UK currently makes to the EU. So again, that's another way of plugging a hole once they obviously lose the money coming from the UK, something like a federal income tax, or indeed maybe a federal sales tax, something along the lines of just a EU-wide VAT. Maybe you still keep national VAT, VAT in Germany and Italy, but then maybe just add like a small sales tax at a federal level, similar to the American system, like state and federal taxes. So maybe that's one way they'll go in, or maybe they'll just scrap like VAT entirely and they'll just collect it at an EU level. That remains to be seen. Obviously there will be a lot of pushback from EU citizens over this, because even the pro-EU countries, as they see decline of their sovereign governments and power shifted to EU, is maybe something that is going to be very much likely to be pushed back against. But again, they will use times of crisis to push through the policies they want. In times of stability, not many people are going to want an EU sales tax or an EU income tax. But in a time of crisis, when it looks like the whole system is going to be torn down, then you could quite easily get these kind of policies through. Again, along the lines of a coming financial crisis, I'd expect much more assertiveness coming from the European Central Bank, the European Stability Mechanism. I think we are heading towards sovereign debt crises in the Eurozone. This isn't something that the UK itself is immune to, but there's certainly countries in the EU and especially the Eurozone that are very weak. Again, these are countries like Italy, Portugal, Ireland, Greece, Spain, potentially very weak. So we can expect to see quite an assertive central bank in the EU. Obviously we have a new chairman of the European Central Bank coming in. This is Christine Lagarde, former chairman of the IMF, or chairwoman. So this is someone that has experience of riding through crises. She doesn't really have any central bank experience, but her experience through the IMF and certainly the contacts she made while she was chairwoman of the IMF is going to place her well to be like very assertive, very strong, riding through sovereign debt crises and problems in the euro. I think that's why she has been given the role at the top of the ECB. She is someone that will be very assertive, very strong, because that's what the currency will need. I think the problems facing the euro currency are immense. I don't ultimately think they're going to be able to ride through these currencies particularly well. I think the euro will collapse at some point in the future. But if they got someone strong, if they got someone who can inspire a lot of confidence, they can probably kick the can down the road and get this Eurozone project to last maybe a few years longer than it would have. Along other areas where the EU will probably expand power, things like Europol and these agencies, which security agencies that in theory protect people in the EU, how much they really do or don't do. If we see a shift of power from national security agencies, national police, shifting them to Europol, that in the future will make it very difficult for any other countries to leave in the future, because the more power you shift to the EU, it's going to be very difficult to get that power back in the future. Just look at everything that's happening with Brexit. It's extremely difficult to get out of this supposed trading bloc. It's much more than a trading bloc, and the further they integrate everything, so areas like Europol, I'll definitely expect those to gain more power, to shift the ability for individual states to govern themselves and shift the power to the EU. Ultimately will make it almost impossible. I think once another 4 or 5 years have ticked by, assuming the EU doesn't collapse in that time, because I expect there will be a very large recession before people like von der Leyen step down from her tenureship, we're going to be seeing quite extreme things happen in the EU, assuming they ride it out, which they probably will do. I think the real crisis is going to come 10-15 years down the road. But it's going to be almost impossible once the next 4 or 5 years have ticked by and von der Leyen will be relieved of her post. I think it'll be all but impossible for other countries to leave the EU, bar like just mass crisis. It will be like a mass crisis. Maybe Italy, when they can't pay their debts anymore, maybe they will leave, but it will be a huge problem. In my opinion, the UK is getting out just at the right time, because it's going to be very, very difficult and very, very painful for any country in the future which does choose to leave. So thankfully the UK is getting out. Hopefully it sort of goes to plan. We get out in the next few months. But let me know your thoughts and opinions on this. Are we about to see the full federalisation of the EU state, make it almost impossible for any other country to leave? Or do you think this is just a simple trading bloc and this is all just conspiracy theory? Love to know your thoughts and opinions on this one. Jason from Liberty Bunker signing off, and I'll see you in the next video.